plane was prepared for takeoff, passengers settling into their seats, the quiet hum of the engines filling the cabin. In first class, however, a tense exchange was unfolding. A flight attendant loomed over a young boy, her voice sharp and unwavering. "You need to move. This seat isn't for you." The boy gripped his ticket tightly, confusion flashing in his wide eyes. "But this is my seat." The flight attendant, her uniform pristine, shook her head with certainty. "I don't think so." A few nearby passengers turned to glance at the scene, some whispering under their breath, others pretending not to notice. Yet, not a single person spoke up. What the flight attendant, Ms. Larson, didn't know was that this boy wasn't just any passenger. His father, Nathaniel Hayes, owned Summit Airways, the very airline she worked for. And by the time this flight landed, she would deeply regret ever opening her mouth. Before we continue, comment below where in the world you're watching from. And if you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you never miss a new video. The boy sat quietly in his first-class seat, his hands resting on the plush leather armrests, gazing out of the small oval window. The low hum of the aircraft mixed with the murmur of passengers settling in. His heart pounded, not from nerves, but from excitement. This was his first time flying alone, a reward from his father for scoring top marks on his exams. His boarding pass for seat 3A wasn't just a piece of paper. It was proof of his hard work. He adjusted his seatbelt, glancing around the luxurious cabin, the soft lighting, the spacious seats, the attendants moving effortlessly down the aisles, offering refreshments. Everything about first class felt special. He belonged here. But that feeling only lasted a few minutes before a voice cut through his thoughts like a blade. "Excuse me, young man." He looked up to see a flight attendant, Ms. Larson, standing over him, her posture rigid, her expression unreadable. Her name tag gleamed under the soft cabin lights. "Are you sure you're in the right seat?" Her voice was just loud enough for those nearby to hear. Heads turned. Some passengers shifted uncomfortably, pretending not to watch, while others listened closely. The boy nodded quickly, reaching into the pocket of his hoodie and pulling out his ticket. "Yes, ma'am, seat 3A." She took the ticket, barely sparing it a glance before shaking her head. "This is a first-class seat." He sat up straighter. "I know." Her lips pressed into a thin line. "Where are your parents?" His stomach tightened. "I'm traveling alone." Ms. Larson's face didn't change, but her posture did. She straightened her shoulders as if preparing for a battle. "I see," she said, handing the ticket back. "Unfortunately, there must have been a mistake. This seat is reserved for first-class passengers only." He blinked, gripping the ticket tighter. "I am a first-class passenger." Her smile was forced, tight. "I think there's been some confusion. You need to take your things and move to economy." A hush settled over the nearby seats. A businessman in 3C shifted uncomfortably in his chair, pretending to focus on his newspaper. A woman in 2D adjusted her sunglasses, sneaking a glance but saying nothing. No one spoke up. No one questioned it. Heat crept up his neck. He glanced down at his ticket again, as if checking it would somehow change the reality of the situation. "But this is my seat." Ms. Larson sighed, her patience thinning. "Sir, I'm asking you nicely. You need to move." His throat felt tight. He wasn't causing trouble. He wasn't loud. He wasn't even arguing. He just wanted to sit in the seat he had been given. But every passing second made it harder to fight back. The weight of judgment pressed on him. The unspoken assumptions, the way the other passengers averted their gazes, it was all there, hanging in the air. He had done nothing wrong. And yet, here he was, being told loudly and publicly that he didn't belong. Slowly, reluctantly, he reached down, grabbed his backpack, and stood. His legs felt weak as he stepped into the aisle. Ms. Larson didn't offer to help. She simply turned, motioning toward the back of the plane. "Right this way." He walked past the rows of first-class seats, past the passengers who had seen everything and done nothing. His eyes stayed forward, his chest tight. He wouldn't let them see his face. He wouldn't let them see how much this moment stung. As he stepped into the economy section, he sank into an open seat, gripping the armrests. It was smaller, more cramped. The air even felt different somehow. He took a deep breath, steadying himself. Then, without thinking, he reached for his phone and typed a quick message. "They made me move to the back. Said I couldn't sit in first class. I had my ticket." She didn't believe me. He stared at the screen for a second before pressing send. His phone vibrated almost instantly with a response. "What do you mean they made you move? Who made you move?" His father's words were short, sharp, not panicked but focused. He hesitated before replying. "The flight attendant. She said there was a mistake." She wouldn't listen. This time, the response took longer. The three little dots blinked on the screen for a full 5 seconds before a new message appeared. "What's the flight number?" His fingers trembled slightly as he checked the Summit Airways boarding pass and typed out the flight details. He hit send. Then he stared at the screen, waiting. A reply came almost instantly. "Stay where you are. I'll handle it." He exhaled, closing his eyes for a moment. He didn't know exactly what his father meant, but something in those words told him this wasn't over. Not even close. The response came quickly. Short, sharp, not panicked but precise. "What do you mean they made you move? Who made you move?" Oliver Hayes hesitated before replying. His fingers trembled slightly as he typed. "The flight attendant. She said there was a mistake. She wouldn't listen." This time, the response took longer. The three blinking dots hovered on the screen for a full 5 seconds before a new message appeared. "What's the flight number?" His breath hitched as he glanced at his Summit Airways boarding pass. Carefully, he typed out the flight details and hit send. He stared at the screen, his heartbeat loud in his ears. The reply came almost instantly. "Stay where you are. I'll handle it." Oliver exhaled, closing his eyes for a moment. He didn't know exactly what his father meant, right, but something in those words told him this wasn't over. Not even close. He sat stiffly in the economy seat, his hands gripping the edges of his backpack. The excitement he had felt just minutes ago had been replaced with something heavier. Humiliation, confusion, frustration. The whispers from the first-class cabin still echoed in his mind. Not one person had spoken up for him. Not one person had asked the flight attendant to check again. They had all just watched. His phone vibrated again. Quickly, he pulled it out and read the message. "Do not move. Do not say anything else to her. Just sit tight." His father was never one to panic. He handled everything with calm, controlled precision. That text alone told Oliver that something was already happening behind the scenes. Meanwhile, at the front of the plane, Miss Larson walked back to the galley with a smug sense of satisfaction. Another problem solved. She grabbed a stack of drink menus and began passing them out to the first-class passengers as if nothing had happened. Across the galley, Clara Monroe, a younger flight attendant, hesitated as she placed a tray of glasses on the counter. She had seen everything. She had seen the sharpness in Ms. Larson's voice. She had noticed how she hadn't even checked the system before deciding that the boy didn't belong. Clara had wanted to say something, but she knew better. Elizabeth Larson had been with Summit Airways for over 15 years. She was the kind of flight attendant who made the rules inside the cabin, whether they were written or not. Clara swallowed before speaking, her voice careful and low. "Was there a problem with his ticket?" Ms. Larson scoffed, adjusting her uniform. "Please, you saw him. Do you really think he paid for first class?" Clara's stomach twisted. She had worked plenty of flights. She had seen people of all backgrounds sitting in first class. But something about the way Miss Larson said it made her uneasy. "But you didn't even check the system." Miss Larson waved her hand dismissively. "Trust me, I've been doing this a long time. I know when someone's in the wrong section. The sooner they learn, the better." Clara bit her tongue. The words didn't sit right. But what was she supposed to do? Challenge someone with more experience? Risk making a scene? She turned back to stacking trays, trying to ignore the pit in her stomach. Then, the intercom crackled. "Miss Larson, please report to the cockpit immediately." Her hand froze mid-reach. She glanced toward the front of the plane, her confident expression faltering for just a second. The other flight attendants exchanged looks. This wasn't normal. It wasn't standard for a flight attendant to be called to the cockpit during service. Something was wrong. She straightened her shoulders, smoothing her uniform, before making her way toward the front. As she passed through first class, she noticed a few passengers looking up from their screens. They sensed the shift in energy. Something was about to happen. The moment she stepped inside the cockpit, the atmosphere changed. The captain, a seasoned pilot with graying hair, turned to face her. But he wasn't alone. On the small screen of the in-flight communication system, a live video feed displayed a man sitting in a high-rise office, his hands folded neatly in front of him. His expression was unreadable, but his presence alone sent a chill down her spine. The man on the screen spoke, his voice steady and firm. "Miss Larson, do you know who I am?" She swallowed, shaking her head. "No, sir." The captain spoke this time. "This is Nathaniel Hayes, the owner of this airline." Her breath hitched. "The owner?" A cold sweat broke out on the back of her neck. "You removed his son from first class," the captain continued, "without verifying his ticket, without checking the system, without reason." Miss Larson's stomach dropped. The blood drained from her face. Nathaniel Hayes didn't raise his voice. He didn't even sound angry. But his next words made her knees weak. "You are going to turn around, walk back to economy, and personally return my son to his seat. And when this flight lands, you will explain yourself to the executive board." The line went dead. For the first time in her career, Elizabeth Larson felt something she had never felt before. Panic. The owner of the airline. The man who signed the paychecks. The man who had the power to decide her entire future. And he had personally called about her. This wasn't just a routine complaint. This wasn't a report filed through the system. This was something bigger. Something Elizabeth Larson had never dealt with before. The captain gave her a sharp look. "Well, you heard him." She swallowed, nodding stiffly, her legs suddenly unsteady as she turned and walked out of the cockpit. The whispering passengers, the quiet hum of the engines, even the air itself, it all felt different now. As she stepped back through first class, she could feel the shift. Some passengers stole glances at her, their curiosity barely hidden. Others refused to meet her gaze, pretending they hadn't witnessed the humiliating moment when she escorted a rightful first-class passenger out of his seat. No one knew exactly what had happened in the cockpit, but they knew something had changed. She reached the curtain separating first class from economy. Her fingers hovered over the fabric for just a moment before she pulled it aside and stepped through. The moment she entered economy, her eyes found him. Oliver Hayes. He sat by the window, his face unreadable. His small backpack was tucked neatly under the seat in front of him. His hands rested in his lap. He wasn't crying. He wasn't arguing. He wasn't making a scene. He was just sitting there. But something about his stillness made her stomach twist. Passengers in the surrounding rows looked up. Their curiosity piqued. They had seen what had happened earlier. And now they were watching again, waiting. Ms. Larson cleared her throat, crouching slightly to meet his eye level. "Sir," she said, her voice lower than before, "there's been a misunderstanding. I'd like to escort you back to your original seat in first class." Oliver blinked, tilting his head slightly. "A misunderstanding?" Ms. Larson nodded quickly. "Yes, there was an error in seating." His sharp eyes stayed locked on hers. "But I had my ticket, you saw it, and you still told me to move." A few passengers exchanged glances. They had heard everything earlier, and they knew he was right. Miss Larson swallowed hard. "I may have made a mistake in judgment," she said carefully, "but I'd like to correct it now. Please come with me." Oliver didn't move right away. He didn't argue. He didn't yell. He just watched her. His silence stretched longer than she was comfortable with. Then slowly, he reached for his phone and typed a quick message. Seconds later, Miss Larson's work tablet vibrated. Her stomach dropped as she pulled it from her pocket, her fingers shaking slightly as she read the forwarded message from Summit Airways' executive office. "Take your time. Make her understand what she did." Her heart pounded. Oliver looked at her again, his voice calm. "I'll go back." She exhaled in relief. Too soon. "But first," he continued, "I want to know why you thought I didn't belong here." A murmur rippled through the nearby passengers. Some sat up straighter. Others turned to whisper. Ms. Larson stiffened. I didn't think, but you did." Oliver's voice wasn't angry, just firm. "You didn't ask anyone else in first class for their ticket, just me. Why?" A long silence followed. Miss Larson felt the heat creeping up her face. She wasn't used to being questioned. She wasn't used to explaining herself. For years she had controlled situations like this. But now the control had been stripped from her hands, and she had no idea how to get it back. She took a shaky breath. I misjudged you." Oliver didn't say anything. He just let the words sit there. Let her feel the weight of them. Then, without another word, he picked up his backpack and walked past her. The walk back to first class wasn't a victory march. It wasn't smug or arrogant. It was quiet, dignified, and somehow that made it even more powerful. As Oliver stepped back into seat 3A, the first-class passengers turned. Some looked surprised. Others quickly looked away, ashamed that they had witnessed the earlier humiliation and done nothing. Ms. Larson followed behind him, feeling smaller with every step. Oliver calmly placed his bag beside him and sat down. She stood there awkwardly, uncertain what to say next. She cleared her throat. "If there's anything you need," she mumbled, "please let me know." Oliver didn't even look up. He simply opened his book and flipped to the next page. His silence made it clear. This conversation was over. Ms. Larson turned stiffly and hurried back toward the galley, her face burning with humiliation. She had never felt so exposed before, so completely stripped of authority, and she had no idea what was coming next. Her steps felt heavier as she reached the galley. Her usually crisp uniform suddenly felt too tight, too suffocating. For years, she had enforced the rules, kept the cabin running smoothly, handled passengers the way she saw fit. But this time, she had made a mistake. A very public mistake. She exhaled sharply, gripping the counter. The other flight attendants avoided her gaze, but she could feel their silent judgment in the air. Clara Monroe shifted uncomfortably before speaking. "You okay?" Her voice was cautious. Miss Larson shot her a sharp look. "I don't need your sympathy." Elizabeth Larson spat the words out before she could stop herself. Across from her, Clara Monroe raised her hands slightly. "I wasn't offering sympathy." Her tone was measured, unreadable. "I was just wondering if you're ready for what's coming when we land." Miss Larson stiffened. "Nothing is coming. It was a misunderstanding." Clara let out a quiet scoff, crossing her arms. "A misunderstanding?" she repeated. "Because from where I was standing, it looked like you decided a first-class passenger didn't belong here based on nothing but how he looked." Miss Larson clenched her jaw. "I followed protocol." Clara's eyebrows lifted. "Did you?" She tilted her head slightly. "Because I don't remember protocol saying to move a paying passenger without checking the manifest, or questioning a kid about his parents when his name is clearly on the reservation." Miss Larson looked away, her fingers curling around the edge of the counter. She hated this. Being questioned, being doubted. But what she hated even more was the quiet, unwelcome voice whispering in the back of her mind. The one telling her that Clara was right. She had assumed. She had looked at the boy and decided, without evidence, that he didn't belong. And now, everyone knew. Before she could respond, the in-flight phone rang. The sharp sound sent a fresh wave of tension up her spine. Clara gave her a pointed look. "I think that's for you." Ms. Larson swallowed hard before picking up the receiver. "This is Larson." She tried to steady her voice. A deep, calm voice spoke on the other end. "This is Nathaniel Hayes." Her grip on the phone tightened. "You will personally file a full incident report as soon as this flight lands," Mr. Hayes said, his voice as cold as steel. "I expect a detailed explanation of why my son was removed from his seat despite having a valid ticket." Ms. Larson opened her mouth, but no words came out. "You will also ensure that for the remainder of this flight, my son receives the same service as every other first-class passenger." Mr. Hayes continued. Nothing less. A lump formed in her throat. "Yes, sir," she whispered. The call ended with a soft click. Ms. Larson slowly placed the phone back on the hook and leaned against the counter, her hands suddenly clammy. She had made a serious mistake. One she couldn't take back. And now, she wasn't just dealing with a passenger complaint. She was dealing with the man who owned the sky she was flying in. She stood frozen in the galley, the weight of the call pressing down on her like an anchor. Her hands trembled slightly as she smoothed her uniform, forcing herself to breathe. This wasn't a routine complaint. This wasn't a difficult passenger she could brush off. She had humiliated the son of the most powerful man in the airline business, and now she had to face the consequences. Clara was still watching, her arms crossed, waiting for a reaction. Ms. Larson turned sharply. "Don't you have something to do?" she snapped. Clara shrugged. "Already did. Unlike some people, I follow protocol." Miss Larson clenched her jaw and stepped out of the galley. She had never wanted a flight to end so badly. As she walked back into first class, she forced herself to straighten her posture. She had to act normal, as if she were still in control, but as she moved down the aisle, she could feel it. The shift. The air felt different. Passengers who once ignored her now glanced at her with curiosity, some with quiet amusement, others with thinly veiled disapproval. They had seen what happened. They had witnessed her escort the boy out. And now they were watching her return, knowing she had been forced to fix her mistake. At the front of first class, Oliver Hayes sat comfortably in his seat, flipping through the in-flight magazine. His posture was calm, relaxed. He didn't even look up as she approached. For a moment she hesitated. She had never been in this position before, standing in front of a passenger she had tried to belittle, only to be the one left powerless. She cleared her throat. "Can I offer you something to drink?" she asked, forcing her voice to sound smooth. "Maybe a snack?" Oliver didn't respond immediately. He turned a page in the magazine as if deciding whether to acknowledge her at all. Then, finally, he glanced up. "A drink?" he repeated, his voice even. Ms. Larson nodded quickly. "Yes, anything you'd like. We have fresh juice, sparkling water, tea." He tilted his head slightly. "You didn't ask me that before." She blinked. "Excuse me?" Oliver closed the magazine. "When I first sat down," he said, his voice calm but firm, "you didn't offer me anything. You didn't even greet me like you did the other first-class passengers." A slow heat crept up her neck. I didn't mean." "But you did." His voice cut through her excuse. "You just didn't expect to be questioned about it." Nearby passengers fell silent, their attention now fully on the conversation. Miss Larson's breath came quicker. She had always been the one setting the rules, making sure things went the way she wanted. But now she was standing in front of a boy who wasn't afraid to hold her accountable. After a long pause, Oliver Hayes gave a small shrug. "I'll have a sparkling water." Elizabeth Larson nodded quickly, grateful for the escape. She turned and hurried back to the galley, her hands gripping the tray a little too tightly. Behind the counter, Clara Monroe smirked. "That didn't go well, did it?" Miss Larson clenched her jaw. "Mind your business." Clara raised an eyebrow. "I think it is my business." She leaned against the counter, arms crossed. "You embarrassed that kid in front of the whole plane, and now it turns out his dad owns the airline. I'd be sweating too if I were you." Miss Larson didn't respond. She carefully poured the sparkling water, making sure the glass was perfect, before walking back to seat 3A. She placed it gently on Oliver's tray table, hoping that would be the end of it. But as she turned to leave, he spoke again. "By the way," he said, picking up his phone, "I just texted my dad about you." Her stomach twisted. She forced a tight smile. "I see." Oliver took a slow sip of his drink, watching her. Yeah, he wasn't happy. Miss Larson already knew that. She had heard it in Nathaniel Hayes' voice over the phone. But hearing the boy say it so casually, with that quiet confidence, made her stomach churn even more. "I guess we'll see what happens when we land," Oliver added, flipping another page in his magazine. Ms. Larson stiffened, nodded quickly, and walked away. She had never wanted a flight to be over so badly in her entire career. But she had a sinking feeling that her problems were only just beginning. She moved swiftly back to the galley, but no matter how quickly she walked, she couldn't outrun the sinking feeling in her chest. She had lost control of the situation, and she knew it. The air inside the cabin felt heavier. The stares from passengers were more pronounced. She could feel their curiosity, their silent judgment. She had always prided herself on her authority, on knowing how to handle difficult passengers, on making sure the rules were followed. But this wasn't about rules anymore. This wasn't about a ticket mix-up or an upgrade dispute. This was about her. The choices she had made. And now, for the first time in her career, she was the one being watched. She was the one under scrutiny. She reached the galley and gripped the counter, steadying herself. The other flight attendants continued their tasks, avoiding eye contact with her. Even Clara, who had been the most vocal, simply gave her a knowing look before turning back to organize meal trays. Miss Larson swallowed hard and exhaled slowly. She needed to pull herself together. She still had a job to do. But just as she thought she could regain some sense of normalcy, the in-flight phone buzzed again. The other attendants all paused. Their eyes darted toward the phone. No one moved to answer it. Clara smirked slightly. "I think that's for you." Miss Larson shot her a sharp glare before reaching for the receiver. Her fingers trembled slightly as she lifted it to her ear. "This is Larson," she said, her voice not as steady as she had hoped. A voice, deep, calm, yet carrying an unmistakable weight, filled her ear. "This is Captain Reynolds." Her stomach twisted violently. "When we land, you'll be escorted directly to a meeting with airline executives," the captain said. "Mr. Hayes has requested a formal review of your conduct on this flight." Ms. Larson felt lightheaded, as if the floor beneath her had disappeared. I understand," she managed to say, though her throat was dry. The pilot paused, then spoke again, his tone leaving no room for argument. "I strongly suggest you start thinking about what you're going to say when they ask why you removed a first-class passenger without checking his ticket." A cold sweat broke out at the back of her neck. "Yes, Captain," she whispered. The line clicked off. She lowered the receiver slowly, her fingers numb. She knew what this meant. A formal review. A meeting with the executives. She had seen it happen before. Attendants who had crossed a line, who had let their personal biases or poor judgment lead to passenger complaints. Complaints that couldn't be ignored. And now, she was one of them. For the first time, she considered what might come next. Suspension. A mark on her record, or worse. The thought made her legs feel weak. She had spent years building her reputation, working longer hours than most, making sure she had control over every situation in the cabin. She had always prided herself on being strict, on making sure passengers followed the rules. But now she wasn't the one holding the power anymore. Now she was the one being judged. And the people judging her weren't just passengers. They were executives. Executives who had the authority to end her career with one decision. Elizabeth Larson took a shaky breath, trying to focus. She needed to keep working. Act normal. Finish the flight without making things worse. But as she turned, her eyes caught sight of Oliver Hayes in first class. Sitting there, flipping through his magazine, sipping his drink, as if nothing had happened, as if he already knew how this was going to end. And something about that made her chest tighten even more. Because deep down, she realized he wasn't the one who should be nervous about what would happen when they landed. She was. The plane cruised steadily through the sky, but for Miss Larson, time felt like it had slowed to a crawl. She moved through her usual tasks, but her mind was elsewhere, tangled in a web of regret and anxiety. Every minute that passed brought her closer to the landing, closer to whatever awaited her on the ground. She had never feared stepping off a plane before, but today she dreaded it. Passengers were still whispering, stealing glances at her as she moved through the aisles. The energy in the cabin had shifted completely, and she knew why. She had made a mistake, and everyone on board could feel it. She had spent years handling flights with absolute authority, treating the cabin like her own domain where she made the rules. But now she felt like an intruder in her own workspace, powerless, as if the entire plane was waiting to see what would happen next. As she passed by first class, she saw him again. Oliver. Sitting with an air of quiet confidence, his fingers lazily flipping through the pages of the in-flight magazine. He looked so calm, so at ease, as if he had already won. He wasn't gloating, he wasn't smiling triumphantly. He was just waiting. Ms. Larson felt an unfamiliar twist in her stomach. It wasn't just the weight of embarrassment. It was something else. It was guilt. For years she had seen passengers move through first class. Businessmen in sharp suits, women in elegant dresses, wealthy travelers who expected nothing but the best, and she had gotten used to deciding, without thinking, who belonged here. But today, that belief had failed her. She had looked at a boy, a quiet, respectful child who had done nothing wrong, and she had decided, without a single piece of evidence, that he didn't belong. She hadn't checked the system, she hadn't verified the ticket, she had simply assumed. And now, that one assumption had unraveled everything. She reached the galley again and grabbed a cup, filling it with water. Her hands were unsteady. Clara Monroe was still there, watching her with that unreadable expression. After a long moment, Clara finally spoke. "You ever have a moment," she said slowly, "where you realize you messed up so bad there's no way to undo it?" Ms. Larson didn't answer, because she already knew the answer. Yes, this was that moment. Before she could say anything, the intercom crackled. The captain's voice came through the speakers. "Ladies and gentlemen, we will begin our descent shortly. Please fasten your seatbelts and ensure your tray tables are in the upright position. We will be landing soon. Larson closed her eyes briefly. This was it. 30 more minutes, and the flight would be over. 30 more minutes. Before she stepped off this plane and faced whatever consequences were waiting for her. Her hands clenched into fists at her sides. She wanted to believe that she could fix this, that if she explained herself properly, the airline would understand. But deep down, she knew the truth. Some mistakes couldn't be undone. Some mistakes followed you forever. She turned away from Clara, pretending to busy herself with the drink cart. But she could still feel the younger attendant's gaze on her. Then Clara spoke again, her voice calm but cutting. You know, if you just treated him like every other first-class passenger, none of this would be happening right now. Miss Larson gritted her teeth. I don't need a lecture. Clara shrugged. I think you do, but I guess you'll get one soon enough. Miss Larson didn't respond. She couldn't, because at this point, she was starting to realize Clara wasn't wrong. Neither was Oliver. Neither was his father. She had spent years believing she was always right, but today, she had been so wrong, and in 30 minutes she was going to have to face that, head on. The cabin was quieter now. The usual hum of conversation had faded as passengers settled in for the descent. Some scrolled through their phones, others stared out the window lost in thought, but beneath the surface, everyone knew. Something was about to happen when they landed. Miss Larson could feel it. It was in the way first-class passengers stole glances at Oliver, shifting uncomfortably in their seats. It was in the way the other flight attendants whispered to each other, but stopped when she walked past. She had spent years controlling the cabin, dictating the tone of each flight, ensuring everything was done by her standards. But now she felt like a passenger on her own plane. Powerless to change the course of where this was going. Clara Monroe had been right. This wasn't about a simple mistake. This wasn't about a seating issue or an honest misunderstanding. This was about the way she had spoken to him, the way she had dismissed his valid ticket without checking, the way she had decided, without hesitation, that he didn't belong. That was why she was about to face the most difficult conversation of her career. The seatbelt sign dinged on. Miss Elizabeth Larson knew she should be focusing on securing the cabin, preparing for landing, doing her job. But instead, she found herself looking at Oliver Hayes again. He sat calmly, his hands folded on his lap, his gaze fixed out the window. He wasn't nervous, he wasn't afraid, and that made it worse, because he knew he wasn't the one in trouble. She was. Miss Larson turned away, taking a deep breath, willing herself to push the feeling down. She had to pull herself together. But before she could take another step, her work tablet vibrated. She hesitated. Her hands felt clammy as she pulled it from her pocket and looked at the screen. A new message from Summit Airways' executive office. Her stomach tightened as she tapped it open. Upon landing, you are to remain on the aircraft. A formal review of your conduct will begin immediately. Do not exit the plane until further instructions are given. Her stomach twisted into knots. They weren't even going to let her leave. They were going to deal with her the moment they landed. Her throat went dry. She had seen this happen before. Flight attendants pulled into sudden reviews. Some suspended on the spot. Some walked out of the airport with security waiting for them at the gate. But those had always been other people. Not her. Never her. She gripped the tablet tighter, willing her hands to stop shaking. Then, another notification popped up. But this time, it wasn't from the executive office. It was from Nathaniel Hayes. Her breath caught in her throat. She stared at the screen. A direct message from the owner of the airline. From the man who could decide whether or not she had a career after today. She forced herself to tap it open, her pulse thudding in her ears. What happens next will depend entirely on whether or not you take responsibility for your actions. A lump formed in her throat. He wasn't screaming at her. He wasn't threatening her. He wasn't even telling her what her punishment would be. He was simply giving her a choice. Take responsibility or lose everything. Miss Larson stared at the message for a long moment, her breathing unsteady. She had spent her whole career believing she was above mistakes, that she was always in control. But this time, she had been wrong. And now the only thing that mattered was what she was going to do about it. The plane started its slow descent. the runway coming into view below. Miss Larson tightened her grip on the tablet, her mind racing. She had spent years making snap judgments about passengers. But today, she had learned what it felt like to be judged in return, and it was a feeling she would never forget. The plane descended smoothly, but inside the cabin, tension sat like heavy fog. The quiet rustle of seatbelts clicking, the occasional throat clearing, the soft mechanical whir of the landing gear, those were the only sounds filling the space. Yet beneath it all, an unspoken weight hung between the passengers, the crew, and especially Ms. Larson. She had read the message over and over. What happens next will depend entirely on whether or not you take responsibility for your actions. Mr. Hayes wasn't giving her an easy out. He wasn't threatening her outright, but the meaning was clear. If she wanted to salvage anything, her career, her reputation, her future, she had to own what she had done. The problem was, she had never had to before. For years, she had been the one in charge, the one making the rules, the one never questioned. But today, she had been forced to face something she had never allowed herself to see. She had looked at that boy, and in an instant, she had decided he didn't belong. She hadn't checked the system. She hadn't verified the ticket she had just assumed. And now, for the first time, she was seeing what that assumption had cost her. The wheels touched down. The jolt sent a fresh wave of dread through her. This was it. No more time. No more hiding behind routine. The landing was smooth, but Miss Larson barely registered it. She was too busy rehearsing what she would say. Maybe she could spin it as a misunderstanding. Maybe she could say she was just trying to be thorough. Maybe she could blame protocol or company policy. But the truth was, none of that would be enough, because everyone on this flight knew what had really happened. And worse, so did she. The intercom crackled. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to our destination. Please remain seated until the aircraft." Miss Larson stopped listening, because she knew the moment those doors opened, her real consequences would begin. "Has reached the gate and the seatbelt sign has been turned off." A few passengers stretched, unbuckling their belts. Some picked up their phones, already texting or scrolling, but others, especially the ones who had seen what happened in first class, they were still glancing at her, waiting, watching. In seat 3A, Oliver Hayes remained calm as always. He took a slow sip of his drink. Then, without hurry, he reached for his phone. A few taps, a message sent, and that was when the in-flight phone buzzed in the galley. Ms. Elizabeth Larson knew who it was before she even reached for it. Her hands were clammy as she lifted the receiver to her ear. "This is Larson." She forced her voice to stay level. A familiar voice, deep and composed, spoke on the other end. "This is Nathaniel Hayes." Her throat tightened. "You will exit this plane last," he said, his words slow and deliberate. "A security officer will be waiting for you at the jet bridge. You will not return to active duty until further notice." A full-body chill ran through her. "Mr. Hayes, this is not a discussion." The finality in his voice cut through her. "You made a decision on this flight. Now you live with it." The line went dead. Miss Larson's grip on the receiver tightened before she slowly placed it back on the hook. The other flight attendants stood nearby, their faces unreadable. Even Clara Monroe, usually quick with a smirk or a comment, said nothing. Because they all knew. This wasn't just a complaint anymore. This was career-ending. The seatbelt sign dinged off. Passengers rose from their seats, stretching, gathering their belongings, chatting about their layovers and final destinations. But Ms. Larson couldn't move. She stood frozen, trapped in the reality of what was about to happen. One by one, passengers started filing out. The first-class section emptied. The businessman who had glanced at Oliver with mild curiosity walked out, pulling his carry-on behind him. The woman with sunglasses, who had silently witnessed everything, left without a word. And then, finally, Oliver stood. He adjusted his backpack, buttoned his hoodie, stepped into the aisle, and for the first time he looked directly at Ms. Larson. He didn't smirk, he didn't gloat, he simply studied her. And that was worse. She opened her mouth, maybe to apologize, maybe to say something, anything, but no words came. Because for the first time in her entire career she realized, it didn't matter what she said, the damage had been done. He gave her one last look, then turned and walked off the plane. A moment later, the doors opened fully, and the flow of passengers continued. Ms. Larson didn't move. She couldn't. Not until the last person had left. Not until the doors closed behind them. Not until the security officer standing just beyond the jet bridge took a slow step forward and said, "Come with me." Her throat went dry. She swallowed hard as she stepped off the plane, her legs suddenly feeling like they weighed 100 pounds each. The bright overhead lights of the jet bridge felt exposing, like a spotlight had been placed directly over her. She had walked through countless airports, always with a sense of authority. Her head held high. She was used to being in control, the one giving orders, the one making sure things ran smoothly. But today, she wasn't the one in charge. The uniformed security officer stood just outside the jet bridge. His stance was rigid. His hands were folded in front of him. He wasn't aggressive. He wasn't hostile. He didn't need to be. Because Ms. Larson already knew what this meant. She had seen it happen before. An attendant caught mistreating a passenger. A staff member failing to follow protocol. A violation big enough that corporate didn't wait for an internal report. They acted immediately. This wasn't just a warning. This was a reckoning. The officer gave her a brief, unreadable look, then gestured down the terminal. "This way, ma'am." Miss Larson's pulse hammered against her ribs, but she forced herself to walk forward. She could feel eyes on her, other crew members, airport staff, passengers lingering near the gate. They knew. Some might not have known the full story, but they recognized the signs. A flight attendant being escorted away immediately after landing. That wasn't normal. That wasn't a routine debriefing. That was trouble. The officer led her down a quieter hallway, away from the usual rush of arriving travelers. A door with a security keypad beeped as he swiped his badge. And then they stepped into a private corridor, one she had never walked through before. And that's when she saw them. 3 airline executives sat inside a small conference room, waiting. One of them was James Connors, the senior operations manager, a man who never got involved in minor employee infractions. If he was here, it meant this was big. And sitting at the far end of the table, a tablet propped in front of him, was Nathaniel Hayes himself. He wasn't in the room physically, but his presence was more powerful than anyone else's. His sharp eyes flicked up at her, and Miss Larson felt her breath catch in her throat. Through the screen, Nathaniel Hayes sat with his fingers interlocked in front of him. His posture was calm, too calm, and that was what made it worse. Elizabeth Larson felt her breath go shallow. A chair scraped against the floor as one of the executives motioned for her to sit. "Miss Larson, please have a seat." Her legs felt weak, but she forced herself to lower into the chair. Her hands folded in her lap, her uniform suddenly feeling suffocatingly tight. James Connors, the senior operations manager, cleared his throat. He leaned forward, his fingers tapping against the table. "You know why you're here." Miss Larson hesitated. I believe so, sir." James raised an eyebrow. "You believe so?" He exhaled, shaking his head. "Because we have a detailed report that says you removed a paying first-class passenger from his seat without verifying his ticket." Ms. Larson wanted to explain. She wanted to defend herself. But she already knew. Anything she said would only make it worse. So she said nothing. James continued, his voice even but firm. "We have flight records, passenger statements, crew observations, and most importantly," he slid a file across the table, "the personal complaint from Mr. Hayes himself." Miss Larson's stomach dropped. James leaned back in his chair. "The question is, Miss Larson." His gaze bore into her. "How do you explain it?" The room fell into thick silence. Miss Larson's heart pounded so loudly she was sure everyone could hear it. This was the moment, set. She could try to justify it, say she had been following standard procedure, say she had been cautious about ticket fraud, say she had just made an honest mistake, but she knew none of those excuses would hold up, because the truth was simple. She had seen the boy, she had assumed, and she had acted without checking, because she had believed, without thinking, that he didn't belong. And now, she was paying the price. Her fingers curled into her lap. Her throat was dry, but she forced herself to speak. "I made a mistake." Her voice was quieter than she expected. James didn't react. "Go on, Ms. Larson swallowed. I should have checked the system. I should have verified the ticket. I didn't, and I was wrong." Another long silence. On the screen, Nathaniel Hayes studied her. His expression was unreadable. Then finally, "You didn't just make a mistake," he said. His voice was cold. "You made a decision." His gaze was sharp, unwavering. "You looked at my son, and you decided, without proof, that he didn't belong." Miss Larson felt her chest tighten. She had known this would be bad. But hearing it spelled out like that, felt like a blade cutting straight through her. Nathaniel continued, "That's not just bad service, Miss Larson." His voice remained calm, controlled. "That's bias, and that's something I will not tolerate in my airline." Her pulse roared in her ears. James adjusted his glasses and sighed. "Miss Larson, effective immediately, you are suspended without pay, pending a full investigation." Her breath hitched, suspended. The word rang in her head like an alarm. James continued, "This will go before the Executive Review Board in the next 72 hours. Until then," his tone was sharp, "you are not to report for duty, you are not to access company systems, and you are not to contact any crew members regarding this matter." Miss Larson wanted to argue. She wanted to fight. But what could she say? Nothing. Because this wasn't a misunderstanding, this was a failure. Her failure. Nathaniel Hayes leaned forward slightly on the screen. His gaze was piercing. "What happens next depends on you, Miss Larson." She swallowed hard. "You took something from my son today." His voice was controlled, but there was a weight behind it. His dignity, his moment, his rightful seat. He let the words sink in. Then he asked the only question that mattered. "What are you going to do about it?" Miss Larson's breath was shaky. She realized what he was saying. He wasn't just talking about punishment. He was giving her one last chance, not to save her job, not to keep her position, but to own what she had done. The weight of that reality settled over her, and for the first time in years, she felt small. "The meeting is over." James pushed back from the table. A guard stepped forward, waiting. "Security will escort you out." Miss Larson stood slowly, her hands trembling. She had stepped onto that flight as the most experienced crew member on board. She was stepping off it as someone who might never fly again. And this time, she had no one to blame but herself. She walked out of the conference room with stiff legs, her entire body feeling disconnected from reality. The security officer stayed a step behind her, not rushing her, but making it clear she wasn't free to move on her own terms anymore. The hallway was cold, sterile, with bright overhead lights that made everything feel too sharp, too real. Every step she took echoed in the emptiness. But inside her head, everything was loud. Thoughts crashing into each other, trying to grasp onto some kind of solution, some way to fix this. But there wasn't one. She had spent years working for this airline, enforcing the rules, keeping order. She had memorized the protocols like the back of her hand. She had trained younger attendants on how to handle difficult passengers. She had taken pride in keeping things under control. Yet in one moment, one snap decision, she had lost all of it. And why? Because she had looked at that boy and decided, without evidence, that he didn't belong. Not because of his behavior, not because of some technical issue with his ticket, but because of an assumption. Her assumption. That truth sat heavy in her stomach as she stepped into the employee corridor, leading towards Summit Airways' administrative offices. The walk wasn't long, but it felt endless. She had seen this process before. The forced walk after a serious complaint. The quiet exit through a door meant for employees who were no longer welcome on the flight roster. But she had never imagined it would happen to her. She had been too sure of herself, too certain that she was always right. The moment she stepped through the last set of glass doors, the energy changed. She was no longer just walking through airport hallways. She was walking through judgment. Other employees, gate agents, flight attendants from other crews, supervisors. They paused what they were doing. Their eyes flicked toward her as she passed. Some whispered. Others didn't even bother hiding their looks of curiosity or quiet disapproval, because word had already spread. That was the thing about an incident this big. It didn't stay quiet. By now, everyone knew. Everyone knew she had been pulled from the flight. Everyone knew whose son she had removed. And everyone knew that whatever happened next would define her future. Her throat felt tight. She forced herself to keep her posture straight, even though her entire body felt like it was collapsing inward. At the exit, a younger flight attendant, one she barely knew, stood near the crew lounge. Her arms folded across her chest. She didn't say anything as Ms. Elizabeth Larson passed, but there was something in her expression, something that made the shame hit even harder. It wasn't anger. It wasn't smug satisfaction. It was disappointment. And somehow, that was worse. She finally reached the last door, the one that led to the outside employee lot. She had walked through this exit 1,000 times before, but never like this. Never with the knowledge that she might not be allowed back in. She hesitated, just for a second. Her fingers gripped the strap of her bag so tightly that her knuckles turned white. She could just leave. She could quit before they fired her. She could send an email full of excuses, file an appeal, blame the situation on a miscommunication, claim she had been just doing her job. But none of that would change what happened, and none of that would erase the truth. She had made a choice, a bad one, and no matter how much she wanted to take it back, she couldn't. With a deep breath, she stepped through the door. Outside, the air was cool and crisp against her face. It should have felt refreshing, but instead, it only made her more aware of the weight pressing down on her chest. She didn't know what came next. But one thing was certain. This wasn't over. Not yet. The cold air hit her skin, sending a sharp chill down her spine. The airport terminal loomed behind her, a place she had spent years walking in and out of without a second thought. But this time, the air smelled different. The ground beneath her felt unsteady, because for the first time she wasn't leaving work at the end of a shift. She was walking away from a career she wasn't sure she would have tomorrow. Her steps slowed as she neared the employee parking lot. A few other crew members passed by, some talking among themselves, others moving quickly to their cars. She could feel the weight of their glances. Not all of them looked at her, but she knew they were aware. Because word traveled fast in the airline industry, especially when it involved something this big. She fumbled for her keys with numb fingers, unlocked her car, and sank into the driver's seat. The moment she shut the door, a heavy silence surrounded her. No hum of the aircraft, no overhead announcements, no passengers asking for assistance. Just quiet. For the first time since she had stepped onto that plane earlier that day, she was completely alone with her thoughts. And the thoughts weren't kind. Her hands hovered over the steering wheel, gripping it tightly. As the realization settled in fully, this was real. She wasn't just being sent home for the day. She wasn't getting written up for a minor infraction. She had been suspended without pay for something she could not argue her way out of. And what made it worse? She deserved it. Her phone buzzed in the passenger seat. The screen lit up with a notification. At first, she didn't move. She had spent the last few hours dreading every message, every call, afraid it would be yet another step toward the inevitable. But when she glanced down, her chest tightened. An email from Nathaniel Hayes. She hesitated before reaching for it, her thumb hovering over the screen. She swallowed hard and tapped it open. Subject: accountability. Miss Larson, I'm sure by now you understand the severity of what happened on Flight 1627. I won't waste time repeating what's already been made clear by the board. However, I believe in people taking responsibility for their actions, and that includes giving them a chance to acknowledge their mistakes. I'm giving you that chance now. Miss Elizabeth Larson reread the words on her screen. Nathaniel Hayes had laid it out plainly. If you wish to formally apologize to my son, I will make sure he receives your message. However, I want to be clear. This apology isn't for me. It isn't for the airline. It isn't for your career. It's for the person you wronged. If you can't bring yourself to do that, then I see no reason for this conversation to continue. I'll wait for your response. Nathaniel Hayes. Her breath hitched. She stared at the words, reading them again. A chance. He was giving her a chance. Not to save her job, not to change what happened, but to own up to it. Her fingers trembled as she placed the phone back on the passenger seat. She had never been in this position before. She had been with the airline for years, had dealt with hundreds of passengers, had enforced the rules countless times. But she had never been on the other side of accountability. She had spent years believing she was the one in control. Now, she had none. She knew what she should do. She should type a response, own it, apologize. But she hesitated, because deep down, she knew this wasn't just about an apology. This was about who she was. If she admitted it now, if she really let herself say it out loud, she couldn't take it back. She had judged that boy unfairly. She had let her assumptions decide her actions. And now, for the first time, She had to face that truth. Not as a flight attendant, not as a professional, but as a person. Her chest felt tight as she picked up her phone again, her heart hammering as she tapped on reply. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard. This was it. She could choose denial. She could frame it as a misunderstanding. She could blame the system, the pressures of her job, the expectations of her position. Or she could tell the truth. She closed her eyes, took a slow breath, and started typing. Subject: accountability. Mr. Hayes, I don't expect forgiveness, and I won't make excuses. I made a terrible mistake. I didn't just misjudge your son, I disrespected him. And worse, I didn't realize it until it was too late. I have spent the last 10 years enforcing rules, thinking I was doing my job the right way. But now I understand. I let my personal bias influence my actions. Whether I intended it or not, that is something I will have to live with. I would like the opportunity to apologize to him directly, but I understand that is entirely his choice. If he doesn't want to hear from me, I accept that. No matter what happens next, I will take full responsibility for my actions. I am sorry. Elizabeth Larson. She stared at the screen for a long moment. Then, without allowing herself to second-guess it, she hit send. The moment the email disappeared from her inbox, she set her phone down and exhaled shakily. It wasn't enough to undo what had happened. It wasn't enough to fix everything. But for the first time that day, it felt like a step toward something real. She leaned back against the seat, closed her eyes. Whatever happened next, she had no control over. But this she had owned. Ms. Larson sat in her car staring at the ceiling, her pulse still uneven from hitting send. The email had left her hands, and with it, so had any illusion of control. She had spent years thinking she knew everything about handling people. She knew how to calm an anxious flyer, how to de-escalate a disagreement between passengers, how to maintain order when things got tense. But today, she had learned something new, how it felt to be on the other side of judgment. Her fingers tapped against the steering wheel, waiting, as if expecting an immediate response. But nothing came. Of course not. She let out a slow breath, pressing her forehead against the cool leather of the wheel. She was exhausted. The weight of what had happened today wasn't just sitting on her shoulders. It was sinking into her bones. What happens next depends entirely on whether or not you take responsibility for your actions. That's what Nathaniel Hayes had said, and for the first time in her life, she had. But responsibility didn't guarantee forgiveness. The sound of a soft vibration made her flinch. Her phone screen lit up. Her heart jumped. The name at the top of her inbox, Nathaniel Hayes. She swallowed hard, pressed her lips together. Then she clicked the message open. Subject: accountability. Miss Larson, I appreciate your response. My son will decide whether or not he wants to hear from you directly. That is his choice. Regardless, I wanted you to understand, today was not just about a mistake. It was about how much assumptions cost people. You assumed my son didn't belong. You assumed his presence in first class was an error. And because of that, you humiliated him in front of an entire cabin of passengers who said nothing. You are not the first person to do this to someone. And unless you learn from this, you won't be the last. This isn't just about your career. This is about the kind of person you are. She read the email once, then twice. Her throat tightened. You won't just change because you got caught. You'll change because you understand why it matters. Miss Elizabeth Larson stared at the words. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, but there was nothing left to say. She had always thought that losing her job would be the worst thing that could ever happen. But this was worse. Because now, she had to live with the reality of what she had done. Her career was no longer her biggest concern. Her conscience was. She set the phone down, her hand shaking. For the first time in a long time, she wasn't thinking about her title. She wasn't thinking about her reputation. She was thinking about the people she had overlooked, the people who had probably gone through the same thing before, but never had the power to fight back. The people she had dismissed. She leaned back, staring at the roof of her car. And for the first time, she had to ask herself a question she had never considered before. Who was she really? And was she willing to change? Outside the car, life at the airport moved on. Planes took off. Passengers rushed to their gates. Crews prepped for their next flights. The world kept turning. But for Miss Larson, everything had stopped. Because today, she had been forced to face a truth she had spent her whole career ignoring, and there was no going back. She took a deep breath. Then she reached for the keys in the ignition. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time, she understood. Her choices, her assumptions, they had consequences, and now she had to figure out what kind of person she was going to be when no one was watching.